I'm Don Westenhaver. I know I don't look like Larry Porcelli, but I'm going to do the best I can. For those of you that haven't heard, he had to leave last night at midnight to go to New York because his brother's pretty ill. And so that's why he's not here today, and I'm jumping in for him. I'm the VP of Finance for SCWA, and I know that an accountant is not going to give you the same pizzazz that Larry would, but fortunately we got a very good speaker and he'll do all the talking. But before that, I want to introduce him. Gary Phillips, as you know, is our speaker for today. I went on his website this morning to look at it, and it's really a vibrant website. There's a lot of color in it and a lot of different things to look at. But what caught my eye was he has, on one of the screens, he has 4 buttons. And the first one says 18 novels, the next one is 9 comics, and the third button is 50 short stories. And then at the end, the 4th button is 4,000 donuts. So, which includes...
Bigger than I am now, but it's actually 4,000. Whatever.
Yeah. And it's accompanied by if you push on that button, what you get is a picture of one of the oldest donut houses in California, with the donut being bigger than this room probably.
Yeah,
Randy's Donuts.
Yeah.
So anyway, Gary has published, as I mentioned, novels, comics, novellas, short stories. He's edited or co-edited several anthologies, including the Anthony-winning The Obama Inheritance, 15 Stories of Conspiracy Noir. Almost 30 years after its publication, his debut, Violent Spring, was named one of the essential crime novels of Los Angeles. He also was a story editor on Snowfall, an FX show about crack and the CIA in 1980s South Central, where he grew up. Race and Civil Rights in 1963 Los Angeles provide a powerful backdrop in Gary Phillips' riveting historical crime novel, One Shot Harry, about an African-American forensic photographer seeking justice for a friend, perfect for fans of Walter Mosley, James Elroy, and George Pelecanos. So with that, come on up.
I want to thank SCWA for inviting me out today. It is Saturday, right? It's Saturday. I'm going to talk. Usually, I don't really give prepared talks, and I'm not going to give a prepared talk today, so I'm not breaking any of my traditions. But I will more or less stick to the subject matter, or I'll broadly stick to the subject matter, which is historical fiction, or how I sort of came to write historical fiction. But in the context of that, really, I just want to talk about the writing life, and in particular, of course, because you always be holding up your book. I'll talk a little bit about One Shot Harry, which is the latest book, but out there you'll also find a couple of copies, Debbie brought them, of Matthew Henson and the Ice Temple of Harlem, which is actually, so as it happens now, my last 2 novels have been historical fiction. Matthew Henson, for some people who may know, was an actual figure. He was one of the 6 men who reached the North Pole in 1919. Some say that he reached the North Pole somewhat by accident. The first one there, and some say he was there with the group. But nonetheless, he, Commodore Perry, who got a lot of the accolades, and the 4 Inuit men, their guides who were with them, reached the pole. And I took that character. So I'll start with him, and then we'll get up to One Shot Harry, which is set in '63 in L.A. But Henson kind of fascinated me because I knew about him from the past, and I knew that he hadn't quite gotten the accolades that Perry had gotten, let alone nobody remembered the 4 guys, Igloo and Seagloo, and the other 2 men who were with them. And because I've also been kind of a fan of pulp fiction for a long time, and I suppose pulp fiction kind of infuses some of my work, even though I'm considered a crime fiction writer, a mystery novelist, which is mostly what I write. Nonetheless, I have a sort of toehold in the kind of the pulp world as well. And so, I guess everybody knows about, and I shouldn't say everybody, but folks of a certain age know who Doc Savage was? Yes? No? I see some not. So somebody, you know, back in the 30s, before you kids had video games and these things. there were pulp novels, right? And even really before there was really even radio serials, for a dime and then eventually a quarter. But essentially, newsstands on the corners were filled with these lurid, great four-color image covers for various kinds of it was called pulp because it was printed on cheap paper, but essentially magazines where you could buy fiction. Right, it's kind of a holdover from the penny dreadfuls from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And in the context of that, there was a couple of, this would be also the forerunners to the comic books, there's a couple of characters who were established. There was the Shadow, and then there was Doc Savage. They're both owned by Street and Smith, which was one of the big pulp publishers of the day. And so, and then years later, in the 60s and in the 70s, they started reprinting some of these characters, the Shadow, Doc, the Spider, and so forth. And that's kind of how I stumbled on them, I guess, when I was a kid in high school playing ball. And anyway, so that stuff had always stuck with me. So somehow or another, years later down the road, once now I've become a published writer and have some books under my belt, I started thinking about Matthew Henson again. And I thought, well, rather than write just a kind of somewhat dry historical novel about the person, and some of that's kind of been done in a couple other works of fiction, I thought I could take this guy who had, I thought, a very interesting life and who got sort of passed over, and I could kind of reimagine him, both in the Doc Savage mold and then, of course, now in the Indiana Jones mold, which, of course, folks have seen those movies with Harrison Ford. And I thought, but I'll set it in the past. I'll set it in his time period. So I specifically set the novel in 1928. Specifically, we're in Harlem, or really in New York in that time period. And I had some working knowledge of that time period, I guess because of other things that I've written. I have done kind of, I'm not really much of a researcher, but I guess I'm kind of a half-assed researcher. I'm kind of a jackleg researcher. So I have various books that I keep on my shelf. I actually prefer books to look at for historical stuff as opposed to the internet. Although for internet I'll find certain dates, but really what you really want, I think, to me, as a historical or somebody who's written some historical fiction, is you want that verisimilitude, you want those anecdotes, you want those personal accounts of those time periods. You don't want those dry facts and figures. We can all have that. That's not a problem, right? That's easy to obtain. What you really want are to hear those voices from that time period, hear those people who worked and struggled and survived in those time periods to get their stories, because it's from that I think you can really build a world. So I had a couple of books on my shelf, sort of oral histories of the Harlem. This is during the period of what was called the Harlem Renaissance. And so I use a lot of that as the sort of the foundation for what would become the novel, even though I knew I was going to tell you a fantastical story about this character, about Matthew Henson. And in the context of that story, I also knew that I had to give you some interesting characters beyond just Henson. And so I also have in that book Dutch Schultz, who was an actual figure as well. He was a gangster of that time period. And he's trying to, and part of the plot is about he's trying to muscle in on the numbers racket, which is controlled by the black gangsters in Harlem. And in particular, there's a woman named Queenie St. Clair, who was another actual person, Stephanie St. Clair. And I found her very fascinating. She was actually from Martinique originally, and I guess her dad was white, was French, and her mom was from the island. And but she lived in New York, and she was kind of one of the queen. She was the queen of the rackets at that time period. So once I kind of had that cast of characters, I thought then I could then create a story. I thought I could create something that would be of interest and put these things in motion. So on one hand, I've got Dutch Schultz trying to muscle in on the numbers rackets controlled by Queenie St. Clair. I've got Matthew Henson, who's a kind of freelance adventurer in the context of the story. And then I thought, just for kicks, let's bring in Nikola Tesla, because you can't have a story unless you have Tesla showing up and his death ray. Because I needed a science fiction element. I needed a kind of fantastical element, I thought, to really help propel the plot. You also work in TV, so you talk about the A story, the B story, and the C story, right? So the A story is Henson is hired to sort of protect this kind of public spiritual figure who's going to give this big speech in Harlem. And the B story is about Dutch Schultz muscling in on the rackets, on the black rackets in Harlem. And then the C story is Nikola Tesla and his death ray. And then the trick is, of course, you got to try to figure out these things start in parallel tracks. And then, of course, you got to try to figure out where do these story points start to merge. Where is it that there is a character who might be in the background in the A story, and then this character, though, all of a sudden is prominent or key in the C story? And so the more you think about that, and believe me, I don't plot these all out in some great intricate design. I do work from an outline, but I am fairly organic as I write these things. As I'm writing, to try to address those points that I just raised, then I'll make notes. I don't really make a chart, but I will make notes, and sometimes we'll draw a line from this character to that character, so I can keep it straight. What is their connection? But then try to then bring those things together in a course, hopefully in a narrative and a story way, as I'm constructing the various parts of the story. So anyway, so I thought I had a lot of fun writing the Matthew Henson book, and I guess that book came out a couple of years ago. And as things happen, because you're researching one thing, you of course then tend to unearth something else that you didn't know about. So somewhere in the context of, even though I'm researching Henson and it's set in the late 20s, and I specifically picked 1928 because it's something of the height of the Harlem Renaissance, which was like a very specific time period in that part, well, actually really in the country, which had to do with sort of both black intellectuals kind of coming together, pushing for various advancements, as well as then you have, like I said, you have the gangster element. But the gangster element, not to give them short shrift, was also where some of those folks were able to get loans. When you couldn't get a loan from the white bank, you could go to loans, like people like Stephanie St. Clair, and they were actually fairly fair in putting out their loans. I mean, they weren't particularly onerous in their interest payments. And so I thought that was an interesting element to portray, to really highlight. Anyway, so the point being, as I'm researching that book and as I'm writing that book, I stumble on some other facts. Because I'm LA based, and a lot of my novels tend to be in Los Angeles, mostly in the present. I had never written a novel set in the past. I've talked about LA's past sometimes, or in sort of referential asides in some of my other novels, but this is the first time I've actually tackled a story. This story is, as I said, set in '63 in LA. In '63 in LA, I chose very specifically because Martin Luther King, I found out in my research, he'd been in LA several times. But he had come back to LA in April of '63. This is 4 months before the March on Washington, the famous march, the historic march in D.C. And he'd come out here partly to raise awareness about the march and partly to help raise money toward the march. And he spoke in, if anybody remembers this, do you folks remember there used to be a Wrigley Field in Los Angeles? Some folks, right? Yeah. And that was actually at 41st and Avalon. And I knew about Wrigley Field, but I didn't, and I knew King had, like I said, come here to LA a couple of different times, but I thought it was kind of interesting that he'd come out here in '63. It spoke at what was called the Freedom Rally at Wrigley Field that April. And so once I had that, I kind of tucked that away. I had also been thinking about, this is actually even before I wrote the Henson book, I'd been thinking about this character who now has been realized in the book, Harry Ingram, but there had been an actual Harry Adams in Los Angeles who was a freelance photographer at the time. And he wasn't really a crime photographer, but when King or when Malcolm X and certain celebrities would come to town, he would be there to take their photographs and what have you and follow them around and be at their press conferences and at their whatever presentations they were giving. And I knew about him because I had seen an exhibition of his work some years ago at a museum here in LA. Again, it's something I had tucked away, had made a little notes on and put away in a file. But I sort of resurrected him from the file, Harry Adams, and then I had the King event, then I had Wrigley Field, and so I thought, well, that could be kind of interesting. And I was also thinking about, people know about Ouija, the name Wave from the Past. So Ouija was kind of famous, he's kind of infamous, I suppose. He was a very peripatetic crime photographer in the 30s and 40s in New York City. And he was a real crime photographer. He'd have the police scanner going, he'd drive around the 5 boroughs, then he'd take all these sort of lurid, pictures of, mob rub-outs or some husband getting done in by his wife who finally had enough of him and all this kind of stuff. And in fact, he inspired a late 50s TV show called Man with a Camera with Charles Bronson, of all people. And there's several books about him, Arthur Felig, who was also, AKA Ouija. And so I knew about Ouija from the past. Now I had Harry Adams. Now I had King. So now again, I had these various elements. And of course, particularly if you're a crime fiction writer, you got to start thinking about, well, how do I pull these elements together? Is there a story that I can tell you about these characters? And then, of course, like any of us as writers do, I started to also think about then, of course, who is my main character? I'm going to write a little biography about him before I even start to really figure out what the story is. And once I settled on that my Harry Ingram, was a Korean my Harry, I do feel like a teacher in class, I'll wait. That my Harry Ingram was a Korean War vet, and he suffers from what we now will call PTSD, but in those days, I think they still called it shell shock or combat fatigue. I thought, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting. And what if he does make his living as a kind of crime photographer for the black newspapers in town, which is what, Harry Adams wasn't a crime photographer, but he did do a lot of shots for the black newspapers in town. So I thought, well, I'll take a little bit from Ouija and I'll give it to my Harry, and I'll have him doing this, and I'll have him sort of running around. And then I thought, well, of course, you still got to figure out, well, what's the plot? Now, that's kind of the character, and that's kind of a little bit about his background, and kind of trying to locate who he is as somebody I'm going to put down on the page. And then I thought, well, again, because I'm a product of all these 50s noir movies, well, what if the old army buddy shows up in town, as always happens in these movies, and the old army buddy and he hook up, and they're palling around for a little bit, and the old army buddy hints at something, and then the old army buddy winds up dead, but under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Well, all right, that's all right, that's pretty good. Kind of an old trope, but I think I can make it work. And so I use that as a way to kind of, what's the word they use these days in writing school? Instigating incident or inciting incident, or is that what it's called? Yeah, all right, that thing. So yeah, do that thing, and set Harry in motion, and let him go. But also along the way, Harry himself begins to wonder, well, maybe Ben, that's Ben Kinslow was the army buddy who dies mysteriously or under mysterious circumstances. His car supposedly goes off the road, but Ben was a good driver, blah, blah, blah. Harry begins to wonder, well, maybe I'm just creating this thing, right? Harry doesn't really, he's a man, of a certain time period, so he's not really into much self-reflection. He's certainly not going to go see the head shrinker. But even Harry starts to wonder, well, maybe I'm inventing this, because a couple of his buddies, he has a mechanic buddy look at the car and say, well, Harry, maybe the brakes were cut, maybe they weren't, I don't know, maybe you're reading more into this than what is there. So I kind of wanted to create that doubt. I wanted to give the reader that doubt, I want to give Harry that doubt, because I didn't want to make it too cut and dry. And I wanted to make it as layered. That's the other thing you always try to, I think, achieve as a mystery writer, is what are the layers, both the psychological layers for the character to go through, and of course then the external pressure. What occurs to the character, what happens to the character, that of course in some ways then helps to then push the character forward. That the more they look into it, what's that reaction to it, that then of course in one way is to scare them off, but is also in another way to kind of then least internally, give them motivation to move forward. And I kind of wanted to also give Harry a set of buddies, not that they help him, not that they're like the Hardy Boys and they go out and solve crimes together, but I wanted to give him a set of friends that I would think a man of a certain age, I mean, he's been through the war, and now it's, 10 years later, since he's been, in 10 or so years later since he's been in the service, and so he's reached a certain age. And I was kind of fascinated to try to think about who might be the woman that he might meet in the course of this, and not to use the typical femme fatale, but to sort of riff on that and to sort of reverse that, so that the woman he meets, Anita Claire, is herself what came to be called a red diaper baby. That is to say, her folks were leftists in the 50s and had gone through the Red Scare, and so part of the book then is about examining Los Angeles as it existed in '63 on a kind of unknown to the city then. It's on a kind of path. Housing covenants still exist, fairly pronounced segregation still exists in the city. There was, and I mentioned this in passing in the book, there's just a couple of scenes that happened there. There was a record shop in Los Angeles called Dolphins of Hollywood, which was nowhere near Hollywood. It was in South Central, but it had, in those days, it had the record booth, the listening booths, right, where you could play the records, and they would, broadcast out onto the sidewalk. And so white teenagers would come down to hear the latest rhythm and blues tunes. And the chief of police then, William Parker, was not a fan of race mixing, and would have his police go down to make sure those white kids went back to where they were supposed to be. So all those are kind of factors in the context of the novel. I suppose one of the rule or admonishment I would say in terms of writing historical fiction is, of course, as you learn these kind of factoids, or in my case, I know some of these factoids from my dad who came out here from Texas. You can't do an information dump, right? You have to weave this stuff in a kind of as much as you can in an organic fashion. You can't sit there and have the characters go on a soapbox. You can't sit there and dump everything. I do some historical facts, but I try to make that as brief and as I can, because I think it's important that you keep the story moving. You keep it about, this my job is to entertain, and hopefully that's what happens in the book. But along the way, hopefully I give you a little bit more grounding. I hope it gives it a little bit more solidly built into the psyche that these are real people and that these characters have a kind of weight and what they're doing, even though they're not doing anything. Harry's not preventing nuclear war. He's not, solving any kind of great crime, though a crime does, of course, have relating to Ben's death, and of course it does relate to King speaking at the rally, because otherwise why have King there if I'm not going to use him for something? But that really, it's about his journey as a character. It's about where we start him from, and obviously he's somewhat cynical, he's somewhat burned out, he's somewhat suffering from this PTSD, but he still moves forward. He still manages to get up every morning and put his shoes on, and so I wanted to show you that character. I wanted to give you that sense of a city itself, which is not necessarily, as I said, it's on the path of change. It's not at that moment not change. In fact, in '64, Proposition 14 passes, which was found eventually unconstitutional, but at the point, the proposition said that as a homeowner, you didn't have to sell, to blacks or Jews or whatever, and they codified the housing restrictions, the housing covenants that were already at some point in place, in some cases being thrown out, but those brought them back in, and then there was a big fight about getting rid of Prop 14, but that's a story of another time. But all that to say is that all those are factors, all that's kind of in the mix as I tell you that story in One Shot Harry. So with that, I'm going to read just a little bit from One Shot Harry, and then hopefully we can have some question and answer and slings and arrows and on all that stuff. And the lighting is just right for my poor bad eyes. But I'm just going to read just a little quick part. England felt elated, having achieved a minor victory in his confrontation with the cop. He took a bus back to his apartment and made a double-decker sandwich for his late lunch, early dinner. He then went back out, this time with a specific destination in mind. He stepped inside the Lucky Clover Tavern on Broadway. The bar was originally built here as a location was a terminus for the yellow car trolley. Unlike the red car, which served the inner urban area, the yellow car operated inside the city with downtown the center. There were a few trolleys still in operation, but the transportation department had announced these would be mothballed by year's end. The name of the watering hole was straightforward, but as the freeways came to dominate and define Southern California, patrons who'd been coming to the bar for years routinely called it the Cloverleaf, as in the crisscrossing patterns of the region's many elevated freeways. Sam Cooke's Twisting the Night Away was playing on the jukebox as Ingram sat on a stool at the bar. People laughed and conversed. Ingram liked the place. The atmosphere was inviting, as a neighborhood tavern should be. "Haven't seen you in a while, Harry," the barman, Clyde Hampton, said. He was a barrel-chested man with salt and pepper hair. Hampton wiped down the bar with a flourish. "You been on the wagon?" "Not hardly. Give me a beer." "No, make that a rum and coke." "Been that kind of day." "Damn right." Cuba Libre coming right up. Soon the barman returned with his drink, and Ingram drank slowly, realizing there was tension in his shoulders, a residue of his confrontation with the cop today. There were black cops on the force, but why the hell was it the white ones were the ones he always seemed to encounter? Surely, sitting here in a bar with luck in its name, some of that had to rub off on him, didn't it? He sniffed, having more of his rum and coke, relaxing more. "Hey, G.I., you lonely tonight?" Ingram had been staring at a napkin with the bar's name on it. Now his head jerked up. Who said that? He glared at men and women, couples, and those sitting by themselves. Little Eva was singing Locomotion on the juke. But that woman's voice. He wheeled back around on the stool and chalked it up to his nerves. The welcome alcohol warmed his insides. He had more, already considering another round. "I know you're cold out there." Ingram bolted off the stool, nearly knocking it over. "Hey, man," a customer next to him blared. "God damn, that was Soul City Sue," Ingram muttered. He wiped his wet tongue over his dry lips as he went in search of the voice that used to broadcast to tired soldiers on those bitter cold winter nights off the Nakong River. He looked hard at various female faces, some of them staring back at the possessed man. But this is a black bar. Occasionally there might be a white or Asian person in here. It wasn't unheard of for city department clerks or typists to come in here with co-workers. But there were no white faces in here tonight. And, as he told Ben Kinslow, Ingram had seen a photo of the woman they'd call Soul City Sue. But what if those pics had been both of the pics in the magazines had been more propaganda from the enemy? What if it was a trick by the Red Chinese, the backers of the North Koreans? They might have set the whole thing up during the press as part of their plan. Hadn't they perfected what they call brainwashing, using psychological methods to break the will, making a person do things they wouldn't normally do under their own steam? It wasn't so crazy to think the commies might have reported to in their pocket. White bread eating white Americans who'd been given a whammy and didn't know it. Lost my own place. Okay, all right, here we go. It didn't even know it. And they were under orders from Peking. Wasn't it the plot of the movie he and Stromer had seen that last year, The Manchurian Candidate? POWs reconditioned to carry out deep-seated orders planted in their minds. There had been a scene where one of the GIs was ordered to strangle another captive. Ingram sat back down in a different position at the bar. He was aware eyes were on him, including Hampton's. "Be cool," he advised himself. "Don't blow your top. If you weren't if you started seeing that dead child from Chorwa Village coming up to him, they'd carry him off to the loony bin for sure." "Everything okay, Harry?" Hampton was there in front of him. "Yeah, just winding down is all." He shook his glass, knocking the ice around. "Give me another, would you?" Coming up. On alert, Ingram was poised, to hear Sue speak again, but there were no other words from her. Must be a screw loose in his addled brain. Was he under too much strain? Cobbing together a living, chasing photos of people doing bad things to each other, with the occasional process server job sprinkled in. Always unwelcome when he showed up bringing unwanted news. Maybe he ought to sell shoes or refrigerators, a job bringing smiles to faces.
So, Gary, you talked about the first book that you were talking about set, I believe, in 1928.
Mm-hmm.
And I would assume most of those people are dead by now, but perhaps they have relatives still alive. Because you use so many real characters, what concerns or what did you have to think about in terms of writing about real characters in your books?
None whatsoever. No, because I think partly because they're public figures. You're right. I mean, I suppose Dutch Schultz has some descendants or heirs, and I don't make him look too flattering in the book, but he hasn't looked flattering in other books and movies and TV shows. So I assume, at least in the back of my head, I figured out, well, whoever I'm showing in a bad light, there's other extant material. And as far as I know, they didn't get sued. Now, there is another bad guy, but he I created out of whole cloth. But yeah, so to the extent that Stephanie St. Clair, or I guess Matthew Henson has heirs, I believe Taraji P. Nelson, the actress, I think is like a great niece of his or something like that. But as far as I know, nobody has offered to sue me yet, Although hopefully if they sue me, I can sell some more copies.
You talk about doing prodigious research and choosing characters and facts and things that might align. How do you know which things would inform your story? How do you know which ones to pick?
Do I need to repeat that, Robert? No. Okay. Well, I talked about doing half-assed jackleg research. So I just sort of pick the stuff that I want to use. But of course, yes, invariably you're going to find out way more than you need. And I guess the point being, or the admonishment being, that you don't want to do an information dump. You want just enough which is kind of interest to you as the writer, and hopefully of interest to serve the narrative or to serve character. But other than that, I think you can. You got to be careful. Yeah, you don't want to overdo it. In fact, I would argue that I think a couple places I probably did overdo it, and if I were to do it again, I would even cut even more.
Can you talk a little bit about the trajectory of your writing career and how you kind of broke into it in the first place?
Yeah, that's a sad story. Well, yeah, all right. No, I think, like I said, I've always been, well, I shouldn't have said, but I've always been a reader, right? Well, it helps that my mom was a librarian, so there was not, no escaping that. And I suppose somewhere long ago and far away, I finally figured out that I wanted to write my own stuff, right? Write my own books. And I'd gotten fired from, amazingly, I get fired from several jobs. Anyway, so I got fired from one of my jobs, and at the time our kids were small, and my wife said, well, been talking about writing, so maybe now's the time to try to do it. And I thought, well, that's a good idea. And so I wrote, so this has been in the early 90s, I wrote then a novel, right? And I had another job, but I was young then, so I could write at night. Grandpa can't stay up past 10:30 now, but then I could stay up to like 1 or 2 in the morning. So I would come in from my job, and I had a great job. I've been a union organizer, and I've been a community organizer. So I was working for a foundation, so my job took me all over the city. And but then I would come in at night, and we'd get the kids to bed, and I would just write. And I finished that book. That book never got published. But then I should mention, I finished the book because I had started in an extension course. I started an extension course that Bob Crace, some people read Bob Crace? Yeah. So Bob had just come out of TV. I guess he was on Miami Vice and Cagney and Lacey and such. And he just written the first Elvis Cole book was just coming out then, The Monkey's Raincoat. But for our class, Bob had us read the first Spencer novel, which is the God Wolf manuscript. And I still remember this because Spencer in that novel, by the way, is a Korean War vet. Eventually becomes a Vietnam vet and then kept writing him and he just became an anonymous vet. But we took that novel apart and sort of deconstructed and put it back together. And then for our final in the 10-week course, we had to write the first 50 pages of our novel. And so that's how I started my first novel. And when the course ended, I was still working. Like I said, I would come home and I'd write it at night just because I hate to start something and not finish it. So I started it and I finished it. I wasn't able to sell that book. Even though through a friend, we got it to an agent but gave me some good feedback. And then the events of '92 happened in LA. Again, because I'm working for this community foundation, I'm sort of in the middle of that, and I know some of the players involved in terms of the gang truce and some of the people involved in what became Rebuild LA. And so I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. I could use this as a setting for my next mystery novel. And wrote that book into the middle of the night, and that became Violent Spring. And again, at that point I got an agent. The agent wasn't able to sell it, but I thought I had a good book, and through another series of circumstances, and this is before printing on demand was a thing, I, along with 5 other people, 6 other people, we start a small press. 2 of us are here in the Southland, and the other 4 folks are up in the Pacific Northwest. So me and my buddy John Shannon, we go up to the Pacific Northwest, and we all put in some money, and we do a little business deal. We're all fans of crime fiction, and we do a business plan and all that, and we put in some money, and we actually created a small press called West Coast Crime, and we publish my book, we publish John's book, we published a couple other books, a couple of novels, not from partners. I mean, just people we just paid a paltry $500 to, but we edited their books. But because we had to offset print those books, we couldn't, it wasn't print on demand, so we actually had to get a distributor. We actually got those books in like Costco, and so we learned a lot about the printing, publishing business from having to now do our small press. But that small press then got us a little bit on the map. And so my first 2 books with the small press were then picked up and reprinted by, when I was picked up by Berkeley Prime Crime, which is now part of, I guess, Penguin Putnam. And then, but anyway, so that was essentially the path. So we start with a small press. We do all the things you're supposed to do as a press to, we get reviews, we get them in stores, we get them distributed, we get screwed by a distributor, we lose money by a distributor. We do all the things that you're supposed to do. And, but it put us on the map. And so this is like 94, 95, there's a kind of, I don't know how to describe it. I guess there's a kind of third wave now of black writers. Walter Mosley's on the scene, my buddy Gar Haywood, Paula Woods. So we're starting, sort of that, as a group, even though we write different things, we're starting to get some press, starting to get some attention, and that helped them then to elevate the stuff that I was writing. And in terms of then getting, my agent, I got a new agent, and then my new agent was able then to sell it to one of the, I guess now it's one of the top 5, or one of the big 5, I guess big 4 or big 5, whatever it is now. They're all subsumed under one or the other. But anyway, so that was the short answer to how that happened. Yeah.
I had a few questions actually.
You only get one. You only get one.
Yeah. Just one is a comment, one is a question. I was very interested to hear the way you write your books, because I write it differently. I actually start with the characters and I know the ending, and then I write as I'm watching mini-series. So that's the way I write in my head. So, but question I have for you, I have a couple of novels published by small presses, and even though people who read it gave great reviews, but didn't go anywhere. It's basically became, best held secret, and they jumped. So now I have another novel that I'm holding off, even though I had offers from small presses. I really don't want to go that way because it seems like a dead end kind of situation, because they put it on Amazon, they do the usual internet thing.
Yeah.
But it's very hard, and they try to get into the stores, but then there's a closed distributor rings, as you said. How do you breach that wall? I mean, you come from small presses, and my most difficult thing is finding an agent. I find my book, if I send it to a bigger publisher, it gets bounced back,
Right.
because they say they want to have an agent.
Right.
If I send it to an agent, it bounces back because they're overwhelmed, and they need to have a known writer, and they don't want to spend their time on unknown writer. So this is a very, very difficult barrier I think most of us who try to write have to encounter. I appreciate your feedback.
I don't know that I have a good answer other than the way I met my agent was I was at a mystery conference, and it just happens that he and I smoke cigars. So we were out smoking cigars, and he had seen me on one of the panels, and we got to talking. So from what I've heard though from other writers is that the more you can interact with that person, whether it's at something like a conference like Bread Loaf, or it's a mystery conference, or it's a writers conference where they're going to have an agents panel, and those agents therefore are somewhat more receptive to hearing a pitch or getting one page from you down post the conference. I think the better, because you're right, sort of kind of sitting in blind is hard, right? Because you're right, you just wind up in the slush pile, and the intern looks at it, and whatever, they put it wherever they put it. So I think the more you can have, and there are various writers' conferences here throughout the Southland, throughout the state, which I think you should look at, and then certainly the ones that have an agent's panel, an agent's presentation, I think the better chance it is, at least in terms of getting a face-to-face time with an agent, I think is better than, sending it in blind. Because unless you have a writer friend who says to their agent, I want you to look at, this guy's stuff, or I want you to at least read the first, few chapters of his work, it is hard. It's very tough, yeah. So that's my only advice, because that's the only way I've ever gotten an agent.
Hi. My sister and I are thinking about writing short stories about two little black girls growing up in Baltimore City.
Yes.
And I feel that, we can do that because that's what...
Yes, that's right. Because you had that experience. That's right. That's good. Yeah.
But I am attracted to your half-ass research. I can understand that there's a lot of information available about Black lives in LA and Harlem. But I raised kids in Orange County.
Yeah.
And when I first moved here, I was convinced I was the first Black.
Yeah.
And then when I decided to write a novel, I wanted that kind of as like the background.
Right.
And so I Googled first Blacks in Anaheim, and there were crickets. And so how, and part of my question is, like I said, LA and New York, I'm imagining there's a lot.
Right.
But when history tend to eliminate Black folks, how would you go about finding scarce information for history?
But this is great. You can make it up.
Okay.
You got virgin territory. Who's the no, I'm not, I'm only half kidding. I mean, you're right. I mean, listen, you can find, history of Orange County. You can, there's some of that can be found. In fact, I was going to recommend, what would I say? Oh, there's a couple of books. This is mostly LA, but Orange County is mentioned. Gerald Horn, who's a historian, one of his books that I have is called Fire This Time, which it's really about LA history in the 50s, getting into the late 50s, 60s. But in the context of that, Orange County comes up because of the politics of Orange County, obviously at that time. And so to that extent, you can certainly find out history of Orange County, right? That's not a problem. But the fact that, which is great, honestly, the fact that it's crickets in terms of like first Blacks in Anaheim, and I'm sure there's got to be something, right, somewhere. But the idea that really, it's really not, it's great virgin territory. It's stuff that you can explore. And listen, if it's fiction, the more the merrier. No, I'm not joking about that. I mean, the more, the more, obviously, the more you can draw on your own experience, the more you can imbue that into the work. I think that's wonderful. And I think in terms of facts and figures, I think that is obtainable. You're right. You might have to dig some. There must be like an Anaheim historical, right? So there's stuff that can be found. It's going to involve, I think, looking and reading some newspapers, and you can't get it on the internet. I think it's going to be reading some old journals and some old dusty tracks. But it can be found. But I think exactly your experience that you can pull and push in that. Oh, I think that'd be wonderful. Yeah.
Old census.
Yeah, old census. Yeah.
Yeah, just to enhance on that question, was what I was thinking about is, when you're doing that research about characters, real people, where do you go? Do you go to a library, like you say, historical sites? Give us an idea of where you went to find out the details that we can't find on Google. I
go to books. I had several books about sort of like oral histories of the Harlem Renaissance. Just people who are like working people, women who did day work, just standing on corners and what that meant to get somebody from Fifth Avenue coming down to take them up for a day for work or a week for work. And so the more you can find it in books, the better. Because yes, I mean, internet is great for like I said, for facts and figures, but or internet is great for turning you onto some actual sources. I personally, though, like I would say, I would trust more what I read in a book than I would, on the internet, beyond just sort of this happened on this date kind of thing. But the more the oral histories, the better.
Can I piggyback on?
Yes, sir.
On that for that? How big is your research morgue?
It ain't, well, put it this way, I got, because we have a kind of a converted converge, so I got a bookshelf that's like this narrow but tall, and it's got all my LA stuff, right? So it's got all the LA books, historical books or books about the past. Like I said, Fire This Time, or I have Joe Dominic's To Protect and Serve, which is a great history of the LAPD. I have People's Guide to Los Angeles, which is kind of a lefty guide to histories of LA and stuff like that. LA in the 70s. So that I have. So that's kind of whatever that is, 50 or 60 books that I call on now and then, call on regularly. I guess that's the answer. For that kind of research. Yeah.
When you're writing that first draft and you're convening these characters, could you talk about how, like, your process a little bit? Like, how premeditated is that? Do you outline, or do you find characters? You're 100 pages in, and you're like, I've got to. This needs this kind of a character.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about that, and then as a sort of corollary to that, could you talk about? I think you're a TV story producer. Is that?
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Yeah.
In that process, that workflow, obviously working with a bunch of different stakeholders in the writer's room, how does that affect how you craft character?
That's great. Those are both. So the first answer is yes, I outline. Yes, I deviate from the outline. And you're right. Eventually, or at some point, you're writing, and or you're writing, and the character you thought you were going to put on the page, you put on the page, but now it's different than what you envisioned, because now, hopefully, the first 100 pages or so are going to inform who that character is. And for instance, right now I'm working on the second Harry Ingram book, which is set in '65. So I start right in the middle of the Watts riots. Harry's, of course, right there getting his head beat in by the cops as usual, and but then you pull back, so again, it's like I'm as I'm writing, or now as I'm editing, I'm starting to edit some of the text, and you start to make these notes, and then so characters who show up, who seem to be minor, now I realize may pay off, right? May work differently. I'll have them here, and I'll have them in this little spot in the middle, but I'll have them do something so that you, as the reader, hopefully will come back at the end of this and go, oh, right, that's why they did what they did. That's where they picked up whatever they did, in the middle of the book. So hopefully it's as organic as I can make it, right? That I am working on my outline. I know beginning and middle and end, but I deviate all along the way. I make notes because then, of course, I don't want to get lost in my own roadmap of what I'm doing. But then at the end, again, I give it a read through to hopefully that things mesh together. And I have to say that I really have a wonderful, because she's the associate publisher as well, I have a wonderful editor at Soho Press who, calls me on my shit as well. So that's good, right? So it's like, so it keeps me honest and it keeps me, it keeps everything focused, the questions that she'll ask me. So yeah, and on the writer's room, it's a whole, different experience because you're literally there with, 10 other folks. We have actually a fairly large writer's room for TV. And so we're all doping out. We have kind of a roadmap because we know what has gone before. And in our case, our show is now in the 6th and final season, which we know which FX had told us they would give us that, and they gave us that. And we know we have 10 episodes to kind of resolve matters between essentially this drug kingpin family, right? Which has now been fractured and torn apart. And in the context of that, we have the CIA and we have these other extant forces at play. So a lot of ideas for folks who may have seen this or have been in writers' rooms, a lot of ideas go up on the board, and now it's a virtual board. We're still on Zoom. On our virtual board, right? As you sort of, as they say, break story, we try to plot out because we have for every episode you have a teaser. We have the splash. The splash means you have the teaser and then you have the splash where it says Snowfall, and then you come back from commercial. And then you might have a little bit more of a teaser, but usually then you have Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, and then you're out. But we have a lot of characters. We have a show that has, I think we have like 19 characters, and they're all central, and we actually, not giving anything away because it's already been on the air, we bumped off a couple of those characters toward the end of last season. But we still have a lot of characters at play, so we got to kind of service all these characters, and yet somehow we have to not only service these characters, right, make the actors happy, give them something to do, we also then somehow have to make that all mesh together in our big overarching plot. So there's a lot more moving pieces, there's a lot more things at play. Certainly, in a book you got all the real estate in the world you need to tell your story. You need to tell your story in 250 pages, fine. You need to tell your story in 550 pages, okay, as long as you can, make that stretch. On the TV, particularly because we are basic cable, we stream on Hulu, which has helped build our audience, but we're basic cable, and so we have very specific constraints because of the medium, and yet then we also know that, so there's only so much story we can tell you. And in fact, which is great, I think, for us, there are days when we're in the room and certain ideas get pitched, and you start to look at those ideas for a character or a couple of different characters, and we know we just do not have the room to tell you that story. We just can't.
What's the name of the show?
Snowfall. Yeah. It's not for the kids, though. It's about crack in the 80s. It's crack in the CIA. But so that's certainly, so the one benefit is, of course, it's visual and it's great. You love to hear characters say your lines. You love to see what it looks like when it's made, and that's wonderful. But the deficit is you cannot service all that story. You can't. In a book, listen, as long as you can get away with it, as long as you can juggle all those parts, you can tell as much story and as much subplots as you want to, because you've got all the room you need. I mean, until, of course, the editor comes along and tells you to cut that stuff. He said, what are you doing here? What's this big aside that we just took? But so, yeah, so, I mean, but there's pluses to both, right? I mean, in the end, listen, let's face it, I mean, the TV money is great, and it is wonderful just to see, sometimes I just stand on set and, or it used to be you stand on set, you can't, because of COVID regulations, you can't be hanging around now anymore. But back in the day when you could just hang around, and you would see the actors, they would improvise, they would cut lines or they would change lines around. And sometimes you think, you should do that because we really sweated hard to get those lines. But then it works, it all works because of the characters they're playing, how they play the character, all that stuff has to come together, as you know. So it's great.
Good morning.
Morning.
I was born and raised in LA, and I'm writing it was a screenplay, and now it's going to turn into a book about the 60s,
Yeah.
specifically the 60s. And because I lived it, I loved hearing you.
But you can't remember it, can you? No, anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead. That's it.
Chief Parker, when you're saying the
Yeah,
stage, and I go, yeah, he was a bad dude. But I go to the LA Library.
Yeah.
It's the LA Central Library is a good place to go. There's a Yorba Linda Library.
Yes.
Very good.
Yeah.
If you check out some of the libraries, they do have a special section where you have to get them to come and get a book for you because they're so precious and so old, but you can get a lot of information there as well. But I do appreciate that you are giving us some good resources to look. I researched the LA Times for information that I need, so that's another good source.
Have you seen this book? It's out. I guess it's been out for about a year or something. It's huge. It's like 600 some odd pages. I think it's called Fire of the Night, LA in the 60s by Mike Davis and John Wiener.
Fire of the Night?
Fire in the Night, I think. Yeah, he's on Pacific. Yeah, but he's I guess he teaches at Irvine or anyway. But yeah. So, but it's really a great, just chronicle of that time period. And I have that book, and I've now I'm using some of that material in that book, or just some factoids in that book as I write the second Harry book.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's Fire in the...
I think it's Fire in the Night, LA in the 60s, but I think but for sure John Wiener and Mike Davis are the two authors. Mike Davis.
If I could take us all back to what you read, where was that in the book? Was that the opening chapter or further in?
It was further in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of interiority, but it set up the tension
Oh, good.
so well.
Even though I
mean,
stumbled. Yeah.
Well, you know what? You made me feel better because I've stumbled in my oral readings and I think, what the heck?
Right.
And then, thank you.
I wrote it. Yeah, you think I would remember it, right? Yeah. Well,
Me too. That's how I felt.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How do you know when your book is finished?
When I say it is, damn it. Yeah. No, listen, I think I can only write it so many times, man. In TV now, I got no choice because I got a showrunner say, well, Gary, we paid you a lot of money and we didn't pay you to write this crap. We paid you to write something that we can shoot. All right. So you got to go back, but and you get input from everybody because everybody reads your stuff. Oh my God. So yes, so you divorce that process, right? But the real process, the writing process, the internal process, man, I can only write it so often. I can only write so much, right? I can only figure out, I think if I'm entertained, I guess that's my rule of thumb, right? I figure if I'm entertained and I've hopefully, moved things along, well, that's it. Because, really, honestly, I think the 4th or 5th time, if I don't have it, then I don't have it. I think that's pretty much. I think that's really, honestly, I think that's or at least maybe that's just my, my own internal thing is like, if I can't figure this out by now, then then I got to scrap everything and redo it, or figure out something different. But if I think it comes together and I think it works, then that's it. Then we'll see what the editor says. Yeah, because really, the other part of that answer is you can't write it. You can overwrite. You can second guess yourself too much. You know what I mean? You can't. You want to be careful. You got to think about it. You got to sweat it. You got to stress about it. There's no other. What are we going to do? We're writers. You got to do that. But at some point, you got to figure out. You know what? I'm going to let this thing go. However it is however it is. Yeah.
Okay, I think that does it.
All
Thank
right.
you very much, Gary.
Thank you.
My novel, The Adventures of the Smith Family, is a story of hard work, luck, and success in the 18th century England. Thank you.
My name is Alex Rosenstein, and my book, Sort of the Kremlin, is about Soviet Red Army officer and rogue KGB agents trying to foil the coup and attempted assassination of first elected Russian president.
I got 2 books. I'm PJ Calando. This one is a story collection.
I got my rights back on several stories, including one in the SCWA anthology, and I wrote it. And this is Amy Braden, the badass heroine of the Jailbird's Jackpot. Ex-con Amy has a problem, but becoming an instant millionaire is not it. Should she take down the dude who did her in? Or should she decide living well is the best revenge?
Howdy, my name's Jim Takos. I'm an author of a short story in this anthology called Sleuth, available from the California Writers Circle. The story is called 90 Minutes, and it deals with, it's a paranormal mystery. It deals with Maid Marian of Robin Hood fame solving a murder in Nottingham, Pennsylvania. And the things are different. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jack Martin, author of the Alfonso Clay Civil War murder mystery. The protagonist, Alfonso Clay, is basically the only fictional person in them. The theme that runs through all of them, this is the fourth, Murder by Plague, is that there's sort of a secret history of the United States. This was based on the fact that the Confederacy did try to start a plague of cholera in New York City.
Hi there, my name is Wendy Van Camp. I am the Poet Laureate of the City of Anaheim and the con coordinator for the SFPA, which is the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association. I am proud to show you my new anthology called Eccentric Orbits. It is an anthology of science fiction poetry. Some of the top names in speculative poetry have come out for the book. It's a great read. I hope you'll check it out.
Hi, I'm Karen Sue Walker. I'm the author of the Haunted Tea Room Cozy Mysteries. Tea is for Trouble is the first book in the series, where April May impulsively buys a Victorian home and turns it into a tea room. But little does she know that there is a Bengal cat in the attic, the ghost of a French chef in her kitchen, and a body.